Welcome to Real Vision. My name is Santiago Velez, and I'm the co-founder and division lead research and development at Block Digital. And I'm very excited today to have with us Mr. Greg Kidd. And we're going to be talking about his projects, his passions, his past, and try to give you some insight on where he thinks the world's going to go. So appreciate you for joining us. Thank you, Greg.
Thank you. Thank you, Santiago, for having me today.
So I'd like to start off with what I usually ask most of the people we interview here, a little bit about their past. This channel is particularly focused on investments, and then within the subdomain, cryptocurrencies, digital assets. But we also would like to expand out beyond that. But tell us a little bit about how you got into this space, your pedigree with respect to tech, and where you see, how you got to where you are.
So I started at Booz Allen and Hamilton, which is a management consulting firm, just doing the traditional consulting to banks, to telecoms, transportation companies. It got me around the world. It got me to Asia, got me down to Australia, New Zealand. Funny project was moving checks around for banks. And we found a system where couriers were, instead of being told what to do, they actually bid for the work, kind of like an Uber auction system. And it was done without computers, but we computerized that. That spread throughout the world. We became the world leader in bike messaging. Those folks with earrings and tattoos, and through that process, that company actually went public. And there was a young kid named Jack Dorsey who was very interested in dispatch and payments. And Jack came. He hacked into our system. I hired him. Without even meeting him, he came out to work with us. And that was the beginning of a relationship. So years later, after I'd worked at the Federal Reserve and the payments group, moved back out to the West Coast, Jack came out to live with me, actually helped out on some nanny duties. And in the backyard, this little company called Twitter got started, put a little bit of money into that, worked there back when it was like less than 25 people, and was around again because of my background. The Fed as the first risk advisor, along with Ryan Gilbert from BillFloat for Square. And that really got me going and kept my hand in that industry. I always was still involved with regulators from a company called Promontory, which would consult to financial companies that got in trouble, like Countrywide during the financial meltdown. But my avocation was the startups. And when Ripple came along, sort of a different kind of Bitcoin. There was no Bitcoin company to join at the time. I did join there as the chief risk officer and continued to make investments. So I met Brian Armstrong at Y Combinator. I, along with 5 other parties, including like a Tim Draper, put that first seed money into Coinbase. I was lucky to be around also at the beginning of Robinhood, and was fortunate through a fund called SUSA to put first money into Robinhood. And so a bunch of these other front row opportunities just meant that I was at the right lunch at the right time, kind of a Forrest Gump kind of world. That's how I met Bastian from Filecoin or Anatoly from Solana. And so not a fund from money from other people, but just a fund from investments we originally made in Twitter and Square have then been reinvested in the crypto companies in the blockchain space. And that's a company called Hard Yakka, which means hard work in Australian. It's actually a misspelling of it. That's why I was so surprised when I got the domain name. And then somebody knocked me on the head and says, well, you got the domain name because you spelt it wrong. But we kept it, and that's been our investment firm. And we haven't had to please any LPs, so we can just do whatever wild ass thing we want to do. And we just use it as a learning experience. And that's created quite a trajectory. So what started as a little bit of a joke with the name of the company, it was really just to hedge the Twitter shares, has become a sort of a force in its own right. And the common theme across all this has been, what do we need to do to take these new innovations and make them mainstream, make them compliant enough that regulators, people with badges and guns, aren't going to have an upset over bringing this new technology into the mainstream. And the big objective for us is to give everybody in the world a seat at the table, not for there to be a 2-tier system of people who have access to these new capabilities, but really to give everybody access. And that's what really gets me out of bed in the morning.
Yeah, I can see that in the Twitter, beginnings. That was the democratization of publishing or commentary, whatever you want to call it. And then of course, with all the payments projects that you've worked on, all of those seem to have a central theme, which is kind of this empowerment of the individual, bringing back some capabilities into balance with respect to the overall society. So I commend you for that. I think that's excellent. And with respect to Filecoin, that's very interesting because I wasn't aware of that. And to me, that's a project that's essentially trying to decentralize the compute stack on the internet, right? Where you store files and
decentralized Dropbox.
Exactly. Yeah. So, that's very interesting. But one thing that struck out was you also have that regulatory aspect. You've been on the other side, the inside, I guess, from the regulator's perspective and seeing the implications of change on this framework. So I think you have that sensitivity to their needs, their concerns. And so, your approach is embracing this regulatory framework, creating it so that it's now at the individual level, right? And you don't have to go through an institution to achieve that same compliance. So that's very interesting. So what's going on at Globalid? What is that project centered around? What's its goals?
So Globalid is focused around self-sovereign identity, but it does it with a purpose. We see in the world today that there's a trust deficit. I feel partly responsible. We did democratize publishing with Twitter, but it did create a capability for people to come up with all sorts of fake identities, trolling, things we just couldn't even have imagined at the time when Twitter was getting started. And that combined with things like trustless blockchain, which sounds great. It's like a technological solution, but it hasn't been something that's actually increased a lot of trust in our society. And so what we want to do is come up with a form of identity that's interoperable. So your identity doesn't end up being owned either by like WeChat in China or like it operate in kind of a Mad Max Telegram kind of world or creepy Facebook. We want you to have an identity where you're at the top of the stack, not a government, not a corporation. And yet we don't want this to be some sort of academic exercise. We want your identity to be as usable as like Facebook Connect, but not to just do things like, play just social media or play silly games. We want you to be able to do things like move medical records, vote, move money, and do it compliantly. We want to basically move to the mainstream. We're doing self-sovereign identity so there can be trusted engagement between people, engagements between influencers and their fans, engagement in causes, groups. We want there to be extreme kinds of trust like you used to have when you lived in a small tribe back in the Stone Age and you knew everybody, but we want to do that at scale. And we want to do that not top down, we want to do it bottom up. We're not anti-government or anti-corporation, but the building block is bottom up, individuals forming into groups and having it being interoperable across, not a Highlander approach where somebody thinks that they're going to slay all the others and everybody's going to have to use their protocol because they killed everything else off. There's a great scene in Demolition Man where, after some Sylvester Stallone, after some great act that is committed, they say, well, we're going to go out and celebrate it and he's good, great. Like, where are we going to eat? He says, well, Taco Bell. And he's like, Taco Bell, that sucks. And he's like, well, why Taco Bell? He says, well, they won the fast food war. So everything's Taco Bell now. And so I don't want to live in a world where we have interoperability because everything else has been killed off and some corporate or governmental thing now just dominates everything. I want it to be heterogeneous and, like bottom up and yet still interoperable. So that's the mission of the world. And it is built around the concept of a namespace, which should be familiar to anyone who knows what DNS. We have one internet because you just need to type in a name .com and you're not trapped in a Chinese or a Brazilian internet. You can go anywhere for a website. We'd like to do the same with identity, that you have a name. You can have more than one name, but no two people can have the same name. And names can be held by people or groups, and those names are universally recognized around the world. They have a reputation attached to them that you build up, like an Easter egg hunt of collecting credentials. We're not the people or the party that's telling who to trust and who not. We're simply the protocol so that as you collect these credentials, you can write down and have a cryptographically secure way of saying who said what about who when. And if someone wants to rely on those credentials, they can. If they decide that's not enough for you to get on this plane or open this bank account or do this vote, so be it. But to the extent that there's standards, we want to make it easy for people to collect and meet those standards. And so that's our mission, is to give people the ability to create trusted identities, trusted reputations, still privacy preserving, still secure, but bottom up rather than top down.
Hey, if you like this clip, be sure to like and subscribe for more crypto-related content. Also, be sure to check out the full interview and more only on realvision.com/crypto.